Hey guys, Wave Nunnally here with Bible Unplugged. Thanks for joining us again for another deep dive into Scripture. In this episode, we're going to be kind of wedding a number of things. We have been doing a temple emphasis and trying to familiarize ourselves through visuals and through ancient literature with the realities of the temple in the time of Jesus. But we're also at the time of year where we are celebrating the Feast of Shavuot, or weeks. And it's just ended in the diaspora as of last night, sundown. But we're going to continue our discussion of this Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, or Shavuot in our discussion today. So hopefully it will be enlightening and helpful. That's certainly our prayer for you. So we're going to be first looking at the Torah, the Law of Moses. There are a couple of passages there that describe this festival and its relation to two other important festivals. So three in all. Book of Exodus. 3 times a year you shall celebrate a festival. By the way, God is into celebrating. He's into victory. He's into His people living in safety, security, and prosperity. And so 3 times a year you have to celebrate these major events, acts of God in moving His people more and more in the direction of deliverance and freedom. 3 times a year you celebrate a feast. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, that would be, little quiz right here at the beginning, Passover, unleavened bread, matzah. And so we have the first feast, the first of the year, according to the book of Exodus, is the Feast of Passover. The next is the Feast of the Harvest of First Fruits. That's what this text is calling Shavuot, or weeks, or Pentecost. Rest from your labors, etc. And then the Feast of the Ingathering. This is the end of the agricultural cycle. It's the last and greatest, largest harvest of the year. This is the Feast of Sukkot, or tabernacles, or booths, and comes sometime in mid-September to mid-October. 3 times a year. Again, it's stated at the end, beginning and end. 3 times a year, all of your males are supposed to appear before the Lord. That would involve a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, regardless of where you lived. Another text in the Torah, or Law of Moses, is in the Book of Deuteronomy. Again, 3 times a year, all of your males shall appear before Yahweh, your God, in the place He chooses, which we know historically now, developmentally ends up being Jerusalem, and specifically the Temple Mount. At the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that's again, quick pop quiz, Passover. Unleavened bread, Feast of Passover. Next one, the Feast of Weeks. What are some other names for that? The Hebrew would be Shavuot. That's this time of the year. It's when the first parts of the harvest begin to come in. And this is also called Pentecost. And so then we also have the Feast of Booths, or in Hebrew, Sukkot, and also called the Feast of Tabernacles. They shall not appear before Yahweh empty-handed. So a real quick review. The biblical feasts, the required pilgrimage feasts, the 3 great festivals as required by the Torah, or Law of Moses, are Passover, that begins this yearly cycle. That's when the seed is put into the ground. Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, or First Fruits. And then the last one of the year comes in the fall at the last great harvest, and that is the Feast of Sukkot, where the requirement is to dwell in temporary booths, and this is also called tabernacles, booths, and sometimes, as in the text we saw, ingathering. In the Gospel of John, interestingly, now we're skipping over into the next testament from Hebrew Bible, now New Testament, and we're in the Gospel of John and in the life and ministry of Jesus, but we get, I would argue, from this text right here, we get a collapsing, we get a synthesis of all 3 of these major Jewish festivals. Lots of people take the feasts and turn them into some kind of end time, or Jesus has to fulfill every component or whatever. But what we're going to do is look at the way that this text about Jesus weds those 3 together. John chapter 7. the Feast of the Jews, the Feast of Booths. Now let's think again about that review slide just a moment ago. Booths, Tabernacles, Sukkot. So it's at the end of the agricultural cycle. The Feast of the Booths was at hand, and in the midst of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple, okay? Then it mentions again, he cried out in the temple, as in verse 28. And then in verse 45, the officers, and these are not Roman officers, these are Jewish temple guards who are directly reporting to the chief priests. So the temple guards came to the chief priests, that's all proper and in place, and they began to give a report about this ministry of Jesus in the temple, where the temple guards functioned and where the chief priests presided. So all of this has to do with the temple. Therefore, this fits in well with our series that we're doing on the temple and the life and ministry of Jesus. So in John 7, again, the same passage, John chapter 7, on the last day, the great day of the feast, in Hebrew it's called the Hoshana Rabbah, the last day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out saying, if anyone is thirsty, then let him come to me and to drink. Why would that be? In the middle of the temple and no water fountains around anywhere, could have talked about anything else in the world, but he mentions thirst, which requires water to satisfy, and that he is the source. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture says, from his innermost being will flow rivers of living water. We've got all kinds of connect points that we want to share with you in this teaching today. So, from his, this is simply the masculine singular third person pronoun. It could be capital H. From Jesus' innermost being will flow rivers as the source of living water. This could very well be a self-reference. It could also be a reference, as in reference to the temple itself, as the representation of the dwelling presence of God with people. So these are some interpretive or exegetical, hermeneutical options, and play around with those as we process through our material, our information today. But this, he spoke of the Spirit. So if it's the Spirit's innermost being, that would make a whole lot of sense given some connections we'll share in just a moment. He spoke this of the Spirit, those who believed in him were to receive, because the Spirit was not yet given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. So in what way does this passage connect all three of these major Jewish festivals that are required by the Torah? Well, here you have the Hoshana Rabbah, which is connected to Sukkot. So you have tabernacles here. We've also got, he spoke this of the Spirit that was yet to be given. That took place, Acts chapter 2, during the festival of Pentecost or Shavuot, this time of year, the Feast of Weeks. And then the last one, Passover, Jesus was not yet glorified. That's a reference to Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection, and then even ascension, all taking place around the time of the Passover, at the beginning of the spring, the beginning of planting. So this is a third passage, in addition to the Exodus and the Deuteronomy passage, that put together all three of these major festivals. Now, let's dive into the deep end of the pool, and let's take a look at some backgrounds that I think further illuminate this important saying of Jesus that happened in the temple, that happened during one of these major festivals, Sukkot, the last one, the Feast of Tabernacle, or the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. And let's take a look at what the rabbis had to say. The earliest rabbis are going to say, how was the water libation performed? That's the pouring of water as a sacrifice onto the altar of sacrifice. A golden flagon holding 1.5 pints was filled with water from the Shiloach. We know of this as the pool of Siloam. Okay? When they reached the water gate, they sounded a trumpet, then another, and then the priest went up on the ramp of the altar and turned, and there were 2 silver bowls there with which he poured that water that was taken from the pool of Siloam onto the altar. Why? Because this signaled the beginning of prayers for the early rains that would start the ground preparation for the planting that would take place at the next stage, at Passover yet again. So preparing for the next stage of harvest for the next year's crop. Also in the Mishnah, in the same tractate, Sukkah, as in Sukkot, whoever has never seen the joy of the Beit HaShuvah or Shoevah has never seen in his life such joy. This is a reference to that drawing of the water for this priestly procession to go back to the temple and pour out the water libation on the altar of burnt offering. The rabbis make another connection. They connect Isaiah 12 to this act of this process of pouring out an offering of water to the Lord and the beginning of prayers for the next year's crop. Therefore, you will joyously draw water from the well springs of salvation. And what's interesting here, if Jesus has this in his mind, he's possibly seeing this word salvation. I wrote it out in English here, Yeshua. Here it is in Hebrew. In fact, there's that whole passage in Isaiah 12 there, is you will joyously draw these living waters from Jesus himself. That possibly is a way that Jesus is working with this text and including that or insinuating that by his teaching in John chapter 7. Now, let's go to some visuals and do some quick review. In looking at the temple in the past, the last couple of episodes, we've started from the east. We're looking from the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley, and we're looking at the east side, the eastern wall of the city of Jerusalem, which is also the eastern wall of the Temple Mount. So you have these porticos that we talked about in the last episode, including Solomon's portico here on the southeast quadrant of the enclosure wall. The largest court is the court of the Gentiles. We have the holy place here with the Holy of Holies underneath this building structure here, the royal portico or the house of shops as mentioned by the rabbis, and then Jerusalem folding out in every direction except for the east around the Temple Mount. Here's a close-up. We're looking at the holy place. We've talked already about the middle wall of partition, court of the women. This very narrow and roofed court is the court of the Israelites. Inside of that is where the sacrifice took place. So this is the court of the priest, and inside this tallest building is the Holy of Holies. Just another perspective on this. Now we're looking from the south northward. We were looking from up on this parapet down onto this large approximately 1 acre in size model of the city as it existed just before its destruction in AD 70. Most of this would approximate the city of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount in Jesus' life and ministry as well. And so you can see now the southern wall of the temple. Below that, this little narrow finger here is the city of David. It's only about 6 acres in size. So this is Jerusalem in David's day. This would be Jerusalem in Hezekiah's day, and then the whole thing is the city of Jerusalem in Jesus' day. Well, going downhill from the temple, there's a series of steps. You can see those here. Those have been discovered. We'll see them in a moment. But those steps end in this structure here, which is the pool of Siloam. Another little bit different angle. We're looking from the southeast now, and right here is the pool of Siloam. It actually has a little bit of water in it. It must have rained that day or the day before this picture was taken. Here's your Temple Mount. Here's the southern wall of the Temple Mount. This is the city of David, and you have the staircase running downhill to the pool of Siloam. This is exactly where Jesus sent the man who was born blind to wash the mud from his eyes at the pool of Siloam, walking straight downhill, down this stairway, these steps, to the pool of Siloam. No turns, no twists, no curves, straight downhill all the way. Here is a picture of those steps that have been discovered and continue to be worked on. And in the very near future, within the next year, there will be a walkway that pilgrims, that students are allowed to use themselves and walk that same way that the man born blind walked on. These go back to the time of Jesus, to the days of Pontius Pilate, and absolutely exciting to be on site and to revisit, to actually reenact these biblical accounts. You can do it with your whole body involved, walking up these steps, going back up in the direction of the temple. If you turned around and you walked down the steps, you end up dead ending at the pool of Siloam. So in 2004, a friend of mine, Eli Shukron, was helping some city workers who had to repair a problem with some pipes, underground pipes. And during the repairs, the earth mover hit stone steps that were worked stone, stone that had been chiseled by human hands. So very quickly, experts were brought in, excavation took place, and the pool of Siloam began to unfold. Here's another picture at another stage of the excavation, and now here is yet another. Now we have a wonderful sitting location here with wooden steps and with a little roof above to protect you from the direct sun. The pool of Siloam and the water, notice the steps going down into the water, would continue out into this garden, which is owned privately and can't be excavated yet at this point. This is the beginning right here of that set of steps that we saw on the previous slide. Now, to go in a little bit different direction, but to pursue the teachings of the early rabbis, the ancient rabbis, notice my asterisk here, and notice what it goes down to. I'm giving you the references in rabbinic literature. These are out in public domain, and they can be referenced in English by anybody that wants these. So I'm always citing my references. This is what far too many preachers and teachers, even some professors, do not do. You should have access to the same material that I have access to and draw my conclusions from. And so for that reason, you will always see here at Bible Unplugged, we cite our sources because you deserve that. All right. So the ancient rabbis connected this event with two specific passages in the Hebrew Bible. What would those be? Well, one of them we already looked at briefly, the Isaiah 12 passage. The main ones, however, Zechariah 14, is so influential among the early rabbis that it actually found its way into the liturgy, and you still find references to Zechariah 14 in the Jewish prayer book today. But also another passage the rabbis are constantly referring to in reference to this water drawing, this life-giving river, is obviously Ezekiel 47. We'll take a look at both of those in order. Zechariah 14, it will come about in that day, he's looking forward into the end-time future, that living waters, that seems to be exactly what Jesus is talking about. Rivers of living water will flow out of the innermost being. Living waters will flow out of Jerusalem. Half of them toward the east and half of them toward the western sea. That would be the Mediterranean. What would the eastern sea be then? What we call the Dead Sea. What the Bible calls the eastern sea or the Salt Sea. Right? And the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as in winter. So this is an ever-flowing source of life-giving water. That's not typical in the land of Israel when you're moving east-west. For it to run all year round, but consider the source. It's going to come out of Jerusalem and from the presence of God. Summer as well as winter, there's a parallel in Ezekiel 47 that we'll get to in just a moment. Then it will come about, and this is Zechariah 14, this end time battle, where the nations of the world come against Jerusalem, but God intervenes and He takes care of the enemies, and all of those who are left over, any of the stragglers, any of the remnants of these armies of the nations that came up against Jerusalem, they're going to turn around and they're going to be going up to Jerusalem, not for war, but for worship. Not for war, but for worship. We'll go up year to year to worship the King. That's every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. They're going to worship Yahweh of hosts, and they're going to celebrate, bam, there it is, Feast of Booths, that festival or Feast of Sukkot that we talked about, that concludes the year and brings in that final harvest of, yes, produce and also human souls. And it will be that whatever families of the earth that don't go up to do this kind of worship at the Feast of Booths, no rain will fall on them. So notice again the connection between water and the Feast of Booths. Now let's go to the Ezekiel passage, because Ezekiel predates Zechariah by at least a century. And so we're going to look at Zechariah's influence, at his point of inspiration. 100 years before that, approximately, Ezekiel is saying, then God brought me to the door of the house. He's seeing this in the end time future. Water was flowing from under the threshold toward the east. Same thing that Zechariah said. For the house faced east, and the water was flowing down. Notice this is living water. It's moving water. It's life-giving water. Down from under, from the right side of the house, from the south of the altar. And he brought me out, and the water was trickling from the south side. And then they moved out 1,000 cubits. And as this water was flowing out of Jerusalem toward the east, 1,000 cubits later, it reached the ankles. Then another 1,000 cubits, and the water was reaching the knees. In other words, instead of getting less and less as it moved away from that source, the presence of God, it's not getting less, it's growing less, it's growing more and more. It's moving in the direction of a flood stage. Then another 1,000 cubits, and the water was reaching the loins all the way up to the belt. He measured another 1,000 cubits, and it was a river that I could not ford. You couldn't go across this river. There were very many trees on either side. These waters are going toward the sea, and I've filled in the Salt Sea because that's the only sea in the direction of the east from Jerusalem. And they were being made to flow to the sea, and the waters of the sea were becoming fresh. This is truly miraculous, supernatural, end-timesy kind of stuff. Why is that? Because today, the Dead Sea, Salt Sea, Eastern Sea, whatever you want to call it, is 34% mineral and saline. This is a place where, guys, you can almost walk on water. There aren't any floats being rented or sold there because you just lie down and that is the sea is your float. You're so buoyant. And so for these waters that are 34% mineral and saline to then become fresh, that's a truly kind of new age, new time period, messianic age, new heavens, new earth kind of situation. Every living creature in every place where the river goes will live. It's bringing life. This is life-giving. This is living water and life-giving water. For these waters go there, and they're going to be all kinds of fresh water, and there's going to be all kinds of fish. So everything is going to live where the river goes. There will even be fishermen that will stand beside it, the Dead Sea, Salt Sea, Eastern Sea. From Ein Gedi to Ein Eglaim, there will be a place for the spreading of nets, just like they do over at the Great Sea, which we call the Mediterranean. And by the river, on its banks, there are going to be all kinds of trees for food. They will bear every month because their water flows from the sanctuary. In other words, no relaxing of water. There will always be plenty of water, even in the dry, arid summer months of the land of Israel. Zechariah tells us the same thing, that there's going to be water in the summer in the same way that there's water in the winter, where winter rains typically cause these kinds of flash flood type events. You know, whether you're looking at Jesus' words in John 7, or you're looking at Zechariah's words in Zechariah 14, or Ezekiel's words in Ezekiel 47, we're really going further back into the tradition, and we can see that those sorts of formulations are just the reformulations of what Isaiah said in the 8th century BC. Isaiah is saying, "Behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth." You see what's going on in John 7, Zechariah 14, Ezekiel 47, as we go further and further back into the tradition, is that this is a miraculous supernatural event. This is indeed the age of the Spirit. This is what the rabbis referred to as Yamot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah. This is the Messianic era in which, and notice that Isaiah is simply, when he talks about new heavens and new earth, well, that is like, okay, well, what happened back in the old heavens and the old earth? That takes you back to the Genesis account, where in the Torah it says that Yahweh caused to grow every tree out of the ground. And it was pleasing to the sight, but it was good for food. You remember that this is referred to by the prophets. And the tree of life is in the midst of the garden, and a river was flowing out of Eden. So really what we've been seeing, whether it's Jesus or Zechariah or Ezekiel, even Isaiah, is a return to the original, beautiful, perfect, untouched, pristine world that we have been put in by this very gracious God that we serve. All the way to the end of the Bible, you hear about this end time or eschatological river. Book of Revelation, he showed me a river of the water of life. Really, this is a very, and even in Greek, close connection between water of life and living water. Clear as crystal, coming from the throne of God and the Lamb. Notice that Yahweh and the Lamb are occupying the same throne, much like we see in the book of 1 Enoch, a non-biblical between the Testaments book. In the middle of the street, and on either side of the river was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit and yielding its fruit every month, without fail, even in winter, even in summer. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. This is God's end time plan. So, real quick, I'd like to show you some imagery of what you have been hearing about in words. Now I would like for you to see it in reality. Here is a picture of that Kidron Valley. So this is a part of the city of David dig. All that city of David is right here. This is the Kidron Valley. This is a Siloam village, and all this is the valley of the burial of the kings of Israel and Judah. And then you cut through between these two mountains and head east through the wilderness of Judah. You could also call it the Judean desert or the Judean wilderness. Notice here you have the wilderness and the Dead Sea, that little blue stripe right there. In the foreground, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Temple Mount, right here in this deep ditch, that's the Kidron Valley, and then this long ridge here is the Mount of Olives. After the Mount of Olives, you get that Judean wilderness or desert or wilderness of Judah, etc. And so, if the end time river is going to flow out of the Temple Mount and go through the Kidron Valley, it's going to continue on this process like this and eventually dump into the Dead Sea near its northern shore. All right. Here we have another picture, but it's from the south this time. Notice the city of David and the Temple Mount, okay? That means this is the Kidron Valley here, that this is the Mount of Olives, that long north to south ridge. And so this end time river is going to flow out of the Temple Mount toward the east through the Kidron Valley, through the Judean wilderness and toward the Dead Sea. Is the hill country of Judah in the background there. Beautiful perspective there. Now we're going to take a look in the midway between Jerusalem, the city, and the Dead Sea. And this is classic Judean desert or wilderness or whatever. This is a really interesting video right here. I'm just going to show you a short piece, but look at how deep the erosion has marked the face of the earth. This is what Isaiah says in chapter 40. Every valley is going to be lifted up and every mountain is going to be brought low. That's an amazing moment in human history, actually post-human history, that God does that kind of stuff. It's also amazing that this end-time river is going to fill up this is the Kidron Valley. By the way, this is a great example of what the Bible refers to as a valley of the shadow of death. Danger from rock slides, danger from wild animals, danger from thieves, danger from flash floods. And you can even see that there's some water here. And everywhere the water is, you notice there's greenery. So let's put this in motion. Thank God for helicopters. An airplane could never do this. Now we even have drones. So this is the Kidron Valley. This is the valley that lies to the east that Zechariah was talking about. In the far background is Marsaba Monastery. This is where people beginning in the 2nd century AD were fleeing from the ravages of the cities and were looking for solitude to seek God in a purer way of life. I hope that some of them actually found it. We're going to turn this around now, same place, right at Marsaba Monastery, and we're going to look down to the east in the direction of the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley. Okay, again, Marsaba Monastery, and now you get a perspective, not just on the Kidron Valley, but of the nature of the Judean desert or the wilderness of Judah. And then here, that's the end of the clip as far as I wanted it to go. Then you get this very deep, like 800 to 1,000 foot drop off, and you have the Jordan Valley going from north to south there. That's the end of the eschatological river or the end time river. It's this whole thing, though, is a beautiful picture of a God who ordered our world in ways that could be expected, not surprised by everything around each corner. But there's a time for planting, and there's a time for first fruits, and there is a time for a final harvest. In the same kind of way, in the New Testament, the Spirit could not be given, and then this, final end time new heavens and new earth, messianic age and stuff would not be inaugurated unless the Feast of Passover came and that seed was planted in the ground. From that then springs all of these other celebrations, these other incredible events that God invades human history and orchestrates in a way to move His plan that He has for us forward. And the ultimate, the end time, the end game is this messianic age, the age of the Spirit, this eschatological river, healing of the nations, peace coming to war-torn places, plenty taking the place of lack and need, God's bounty, lots and plenty of water where there's often not enough. This is God's plan. He is an abundant God. He is a good God. He is an orderly God. He is a God that can be trusted then. And so as you continue in your celebrations, feel free to include some of these that are such an important part of the life of ancient Israel, such an important part of the Torah or the law of Moses. And as you've seen now, such an integral part of the life and ministry and communication revelation that Jesus brought into this world, into our lives. I trust that as we've looked at these words, John chapter 7, from the perspective of Hebrew Bible backgrounds, the early rabbis, from the perspective of geography and hydrology, that this full, robust context that we are intent on bringing here to you as Bible Unplugged will have been a blessing to you and will continue to be a blessing to you as you continue to pursue God in His Word. May He richly bless you with this bounty, with this richness. May He encourage you with this what we've got in store for us in the end time future. May He encourage you by the fact that He's going to be in the future the same bountiful, watchful, protective, providing God that He has been in years past. Celebrate Him, and in the coming weeks and months, represent Him in this kind of way. God bless you richly. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch our videos. If you're benefiting from the content that you're receiving from them, please make sure that you're following us on Facebook and that you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you never miss a thing. While you're at it, share our content with your friends and family. Encourage them to follow us as well. Thanks for helping us to reach as many as we can with a powerful message of God's Word in its original context.